Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to hear about Women and Madness by Phyllis Chesler, discussed by Cindy, Aleshkov and Dorothea Annison. So thank you very much, Cindy and Dorothea, and over to you.
Hello everyone. Yeah, I'm Dorothea. I'm a feminist based in the UK. And I really like getting involved in these radical feminist perspectives because it gives me a chance to reread some books like this one that I read a long time ago, but probably quite superficially. And I've had a great chance to really get to grips with the full detail of it, which has been really positive, and it'll be good to share that with you. So, Cindy, do you want to?
Yes, hi, I'm Cindy and I'm from Australia. I just wanted to say a big thanks to Caroline, Norma and Joe for organising me to be here. I first came to radical feminism through a lecturer in my bachelor degree, Julie Kelso. She wrote a paper and mentioned Andrea Dworkin in the paper. And then I decided to order Intercourse, and that was really my first exposure to radical feminist thought and led me to, follow theorists like Mary Daly, Marilyn Frye, and Sheila Jeffries. So now I'll be introducing Phyllis Chesler and her book, Women in Madness. So Professor Phyllis Chesler was born in 1949. She's an emerita professor of psychology and women's studies at the City University of New York. She's also a co-founder of the Association for Women in Psychology, the National Women's Health Network, and the International Committee for the Original Women of the War. She's a senior fellow at the Investigative Project on Terrorism and has served as a writing fellow at the Middle East Forum and as a fellow at the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. She's the author of more than 20 books and focuses on Jewish women, anti-Semitism, Islamic gender apartheid, and has even published a true crime novel in 2020. She regularly publishes articles on her website, phyllis-chesler.com, and the 4W Feminist News site, and is quite active on Twitter. In terms of Women in Madness, it was first published in 1972 and has since sold more than 3 million copies. In terms of why she wrote the book, in page 2 of Women in Madness, she explains, after acquiring her PhD and deciding to focus on what women wanted out of therapy, she planned on presenting her findings to the American Psychological Association in 1970, but never delivered her paper. She asked for monetary reparations for a woman who was not helped by mental health professionals, but instead was further abused sexually and abused through treatments like shock therapy, lobotomy, and even verbally assaulted by the therapists themselves. Chesler was in front of an audience of 2,000 males who laughed loudly at her request. And later on, Chesler heard that she was accused of penis envy by the therapists. It led Chesler to ask the question, well, who are these sad, bad, and mad women that men are writing about and diagnosing and therapizing? And why are they considered sad, bad, and mad? If anything, what drives them to madness? How is their madness treated by what she calls psychiatric imperialism? How do these deeply hurt women cope not only from their social, political, and economic circumstances, but from their diagnoses and treatment, which often furthers their abuse and pain? And the reception from the book was actually quite positive. She was praised by Adrienne Rich in a 1972 New York Times article, where Women in Madness was described as intense, rapid, brilliant, controversial. It was called Cultural Watershed in an LA review. And however, at the same time, Chesler mentions in the introduction of her book that she doesn't tell us exactly who, but she says those in positions of power in the psychiatric profession sharply criticized her work. Her theories were said to be wrong. Her cases of linking marriage and psychiatry were overstated, and the mythological archetypes that she uses were said to be romanticized. But there's a lot of relevance and significance to this book. It shows the importance of women's testimony, of understanding the association between mental illness and female social conditioning. It opens a discussion about female mythological representations and female divinity. it links the relationship between male father-like professionals and the rape, incest, procreation model of sexuality, which we'll be discussing more, and that's one of the key highlights of this book. And also it allows us to witness a diverse group of women's voices and their experiences within institutionalization and psychiatry. And so, the significance is I don't want to understate it, because it's one of the first second wave feminist books to discuss the mother-daughter relationship, the psychology of rape and incest, and how the lack of female role models or heroes affects the collective female unconscious. So now I'll pass it on to Dorothea.
Yeah, so although it was originally published in 1972, there was a new edition published in 2005 with a new introduction, and she did actually revise it. So that's the version I've been working from. I never got the original one. And so I'm just going to go through the introduction that she wrote for the 2005 edition, because it kind of restates her position, but also brings it slightly up to date with some of the developments that have happened since then. So she starts with a reminder about how bad the 50s and 60s were for women. Women were taught that they suffered from penis envy, were morally inferior to men, were masochistic and dependent, and were told that it was mothers, not fathers, genetics, accidents or poverty that caused neurosis and psychosis. There was no recognition of the impact of trauma and oppression on women, and women were blamed. Incest and rape was due to their seductive behaviour or an attempt to get attention or revenge. And they were pathologized for their normal responses to these traumas. And all women were seen as sick, whereas men were healthy. So Women and Badness was her response to realizing that none of this was useful or true. And she says the publication was followed by an explosion of awareness about mental health as a feminist issue, and many women writing about their personal experiences of distress, things like eating disorders, suicide attempts, self-harm, hospitalization, with some refusing to accept the mentally ill label for their experiences, but others that actually found the psychiatric medication helpful. And there was new understanding of eating disorders in particular as a reaction to the imposition of ideas of femininity, a perfect sexualized body on girls in particular, which now I think we realise is also behind some of the adoption of a trans or non-binary identity by girls, that they're trying to escape from these unachievable ideals of femininity. And there was also many other sort of academic books about psychology, but continued opposition from the medical and academic establishment to the feminist challenges. The feminist challenge itself was pathologized, just as women are. So she says in the 21st century, we've still got attitudes to women affected by sexism, racism, ageism, and other biases. Race and class compound the difficulties women face, and it also restricts their access to any kind of help, any therapy. They can't necessarily afford it, and Black women are understandably mistrustful of a mental health system that's got a history of racist abuse. But it means those women are less likely to get help or to be able to afford it, and then have a much greater chance of ending up being institutionalized if it comes to a crisis. So she outlines the issues that she covered in 1972 that are still real for us in 2005. So psychology textbooks ignoring women and feminist theories, courts biased against mothers and pathologizing them, coming up with diagnoses like parental alienation for women that challenge abuse and want to keep their children away from fathers. Women psychologists often show internalized misogyny in their approaches, a preference for men over women, and still seeing masculine traits as healthier and blaming women for not being perfect. Physical illness is dismissed as mental illness and ignored, and that's especially those conditions that Western medicine doesn't understand and can't cure, like ME. Women are told they imagine their pain, and that's especially true if they're already psychiatric patients. Women who allege rape, battery, sex discrimination or harassment are still being ordered into therapy and pathologized at trial. And sexual abuse by therapists continues, although there at least is a recognition that that is an abuse of power. But one of the reasons for this, she says, is despite the great social changes that have happened in the last 30 years, like easier divorce, acceptance of lesbian relationships, nuclear families and the sex stereotyping within them persist. We still have fathers dominant in a family and widespread abuse and violence within families. So it's hardly surprising that mental distress is still widespread. She sees women as colonized. That's one of her key metaphors. I think Cindy will explain that a bit more later. But, you know, we're exploited, we work for nothing. We're told that we are inferior. And many women still believe that men are superior to women and that a woman is worthless without a man. Despite her criticism, she doesn't totally reject the psychology she was taught. You know, she's an insider critic rather than an outsider. She accepts a medical model for some illnesses, such as depression, which is controversial, and that drugs do work for some people. But she does emphasize the need to understand trauma and the impact of oppression, which was something she wasn't taught. She needed feminism for that, and so did depressed and anxious women. She still thinks Freud is useful, wrong on things like penis envy, because he was a patriarch of his time. But the idea of the influence of the unconscious is important, and that influences her discussions of things like mythology. But she's very aware that the process of psychoanalysis is often used to enforce patriarchal femininity. And it also focuses on individual solutions rather than collective political action for justice. And she points out that it's feminists that have developed the understanding of what trauma is and what it does, and that it also results from chronic abuse in the family, not just sudden violence from a stranger, and that rape is about power, control and intimidation. But there's a danger of this feminist knowledge that's actually developed from grassroots activism, not theorising in the academy, is being disappeared. And she does think there can be a model of feminist therapy that is an alternative to the mainstream. And she outlines that, but I haven't got time to do that. But ultimately, she does see mental illness as a combination of both individual and social factors. So she sums up her view that although psychiatry has failed us, but madness still exists, and those in its grip suffer terribly, that it doesn't always last forever, but the stigma and shame may do. Sometimes psychiatric professionals and medication help, but sometimes they harm. But most women are not mad, they're merely seen as such. What we call madness is often caused by injustice, cruelty within the family and society. And she says, freedom, radical legal reform, political struggle and kindness are crucial to psychological and moral mental health. I mean, being asked to be kind has got a sort of bit of a bad reputation now because it's being used against us. But so she does stand by this book and says that her themes are being played out in her subsequent work. The one thing she does say she's changed her mind on is motherhood. Some of the early stuff does come across as slightly anti-motherhood, but she did end up having a child, and that was a positive experience for her. So that's where she kind of starts from. One of the main threads sort of that runs throughout the book is sort of looking at mythology to try and understand female psychology. And it's something that is covered in an introductory section, but then it crops up again and again and right through to the conclusion. So I've actually tried to pull out some of these aspects of mythology and how they relate to women's psychology in a patriarchal society all together rather than looking at them separately. Now, the myths she looks at are Greek myths and some Christian myths. So it is centered on the Western experience. I don't know how women that have been raised within other cultures with other mythology might experience these things, but you can't do everything in one book. So the reason she thinks myths are crucial in our understanding is that they embody the taboo and unconscious psychological processes. It's the interaction of human nature and culture. And she describes mythology as the psychology of history. The myths that we learn offer us scripts and role models, those that we're supposed to do and those that suggest what behaviour we shouldn't do. Some women do take that on, and that can be seen as madness. But she says certain myths reveal a great deal about the origins and models of contemporary female personality. So the main one she focuses on is that of Demeter and Persephone, and they're a mother and daughter. And because she does see the mother-daughter relationship as absolutely fundamental in women's experience and some of the ways we react to our situations. So Demeter is the goddess of crops and fertility, and her daughter Persephone is kidnapped and raped by the god of the underworld, who keeps her down in the underworld. Demeter, as revenge, prevents any crops growing until Persephone is returned to her for part of the year, and that then becomes winter when the crops don't grow. So one of the reasons she focuses on this myth is she actually sees it as damaging to the daughter. Although the mother fights for the daughter and wants to sort of come and you know, get her back, it doesn't allow the daughter to develop as an independent individual. You know, she has the choice between staying with her mother and repeating the mother's cycle of maternity, or being kidnapped and raped, which is not a good option for any of us. It's not a positive growth and turning into an adult woman. So we need our mother's love and approval, but also need to break free, which some mothers may see as a betrayal. And those kind of things can play out in families where mothers don't want to let their daughters grow up, let them grow. The other one she looks at is Psyche, who is the representative of the wife and mother. She marries Eros, the god of love. And it's quite an odd story, this one, because she marries him, but she's not allowed to look at him. And I thought, oh, this is strange. But when we were discussing, we actually realised, well, at that time, most women had arranged marriages and they didn't know who their husband was going to be. They, you know, it was a leap into the unknown for them. So it's kind of symbolising that. But she wanted to look at her husband, and she snuck a look at him. And for that, she was punished by being cast out. And she was only able to sort of regain her husband and her daughter by doing a series of sort of trials and quests, as these things go. So she's only able to achieve the sort of happy family through self-sacrifice and struggle. So she sees Eros, Psyche and their daughter Pleasure as the first holy family, but more positive than the Christian holy family, because Psyche is at least a sexual being. She experiences love and desire. The other goddesses she mentions, though not in as much detail, is Athena, who's the male-identified archetype. Athena is born out of Zeus's head, the chief of the gods. So she doesn't even have a mother. She doesn't even have any identification with the female. And she supports the warriors and heroes in conquests. The other one is Artemis, who's sort of more interesting. She's described as the virgin hunter and lover of maidens. So she's the Amazon archetype. She's also got a knowledge of herbs and midwifery. And what happens to these goddesses is that as male monotheistic religion develops, they're turned into diminished characters in fairy tales. So Demeter becomes the wicked stepmother, you know, sort of dooming her daughter Cinderella to domesticity. Artemis the midwife is a witch. And there's some token Athena still allowed to succeed, but not many of us. So it symbolises the defeat of women in patriarchy, from powerful goddesses to the passive princess that just has to wait for the prince's kiss to rescue them. The other key myth she uses is matricide. And she sees daughters as having to symbolically kill their mother in order to escape being incorporated or destroyed. So the key myth there is Clytemnestra. She kills her husband as vengeance because he sacrificed their daughter to the gods just so that he could go and win the battle in Troy. But she has another daughter, Electra, who was daddy's girl. And she's furious and also jealous of her mother, who takes a lover. And again, that can sometimes play out in families where a mother is jealous and resentful as her daughter becomes a sexual being and feels in competition with her. So Electra and her brother kill Clytemnestra to avenge their father, and they're tried for that matricide. But it is Athena who betrays the female, by ruling that killing a mother is less important than the need to avenge father. So she totally sides with the male, betrays the mother. And this is, I've seen this myth used, you know, interestingly in other writers as well. It's a sort of it's the defeat of the matrilineal family centered on mothers, you know, and its replacement by a patriarchal family where the male is more important, and women's role in reproduction is just seen as being a sort of passive vessel for the male seed, which is something we're still seeing played out in some of the anti-abortion stuff, where they talk about women as host bodies rather than mothers. But it also says that really a daughter can be sacrificed. That's okay. That's not punished. The male is supreme. The daughter is unimportant. And Christian mythology develops sort of later and only offers mother and whore as options for women. And this is a sexless and virgin mother who worships the male child. There's no place for the daughter in that holy family. But overall, she says she doesn't feel that Demeter and Persephone, although they're important archetypes, are not good role models for either the mother or the daughter, because they're kind of locked together and can't escape, and they're doomed just to, it traps women into maternity, but maternity isn't valued. It's a female destiny, but they lack any kind of power over it and power to provide their daughters with any self-worth and dignity. Many women still prefer sons to daughters, and women's role in patriarchy becomes training daughters into femininity, service and submission. She talks a bit about Amazons as a positive role model. I'm going to have to cut this short because it's taking longer than. So that's a positive role model, and I think that is, you know, she does romanticize this a bit, but I think that's fair enough because we have nothing but negative role models. It's a full expression of the female body where we have sexual pleasure, physical strength, as well as maternity. It's a really positive vision. But what she says interestingly is that this Amazon woman-centered society would require women to control the means of reproduction and reproduction. It needs much more than equality with men. You know, she realizes that liberal equality feminism is a bit of a dead end. One thing that does worry me about the Amazon archetype is that the rejection of femininity can be symbolized by the removal of the breast so that they can do their archery better, which again is too reminiscent now of girls that are seeking mastectomies to flee actually being a female. The key Amazon role model that then she moves on to is Joan of Arc, which again is very interesting at the moment because there's a play that's being produced that's suggesting that's representing Joan as a non-binary, and a lot of women have quite rightly been very angry about that because it's a removal of a role model of somebody that's strong and a leader. Joan allows us to identify with someone physically and spiritually bold, but for stepping outside patriarchy, she has to be killed. So it's not in the end that good, and she still has to be a virgin. Now, sometimes Chesler sees virgin as a restrictive role model, but of course, for many women, choosing to be without men is a very positive and life-affirming choice. So I think we have to look at it in both ways. So the other thing I was thinking about matricide as well in terms of what's relevant now is the potential intergenerational conflict within feminism, this idea of waves, where it almost seems like after the second wave, the women's liberation movement, the third wave turned everything on its head. Feminist became a dirty word. You know, the objectification of women that that had been objected to became empowering. And is that a reaction of women, of daughters against their mothers? I don't know. But at least one of the things we picked up on is actually WDI and our activities are intergenerational. We do get women of all ages participating, which I think is very positive and a challenge to that. So I'm going to hand over to Cindy now to do the next section. So thanks.
So I'm just going to put forward Chesler's theory of madness that she really explains in the first 3 chapters. So at the beginning, she's quite critical of asylums. That's where she starts us. She says asylums is where insanity is made. She argues that women are hospitalized often for normal psychological reactions to women's social conditions of marriage and motherhood. So a lot of the times in her practice, what she found was the key reasons why women were put in asylum were often for because the father and husband says that the woman is mad, often for the purpose of torturing their wives or daughters, putting them into place, or to marry and live with other women. She looked at the case of Zelda Fitzgerald going mad as an example to show that husbands gain more from marriage than wives in terms of domestic, sexual, and emotional support. And here she's critiquing the institution, male-centered institutions, and pointing out how it has burdened women. She looks at the case of Elizabeth Packard and her experience of hospitalization, where Packard described other institutionalized women as sister victims of patriarchy. All the while, she continued to be devoted to marriage, children, and a male god. Chesler argues that this is the tragedy of female conditioning. Women suffer from abuse and yet are bound to it. Later on in the literature, this is described as a form of Stockholm syndrome, where hostages sympathize with their captors and sometimes refuse to leave. And Chesler saying that's exactly what's going on in a lot of these cases. She also says, there's this double standard of women's domestic work not being recognized, while husbands gain fame, awards, and accomplishments. Because male creativity is so valued that male cruelty, emotional infantilism, alcoholism, promiscuity, and even male madness is overlooked, forgiven, or expected. And I just thought when we were having our discussion, a good example of this in our world today is sexual harassment in the university level, where male professors are kind of protected by the institutional culture that afford men protection because they're so highly valued for the institution. So with her theory of madness, Chesler argues that madness and confinement are an expression of female powerlessness and an unsuccessful attempt to reject and overcome the state. So power is very central to her analysis. She says, madness is a mirror image of the female experience. And madness and asylums are the penalty for being female. So it's the punishment for either being too feminine or not feminine enough. And often the rejection of femininity leads to isolation, poverty, neglect, or death. These are common outcomes for not playing the gender game or for playing it too well. So why do women become mad? As Dorothea said, because of the lack of a healthy mother-daughter symbolism in our culture and our mythology. Chesler says, female equals mother and loser under biopatriarchal rule. So here she kind of means biopatriarchy, where men control reproduction and production. So they control how our bodies, what we do with our bodies, and how we experience our bodies. Chesler later explains, women are conditioned to lose in order to win. In other words, to win the gender game, we need to lose ourselves. We lose our power, we lose our mothers, our sisters, we even lose our minds. And then we can win, and then we can be protected, but only to some extent, right? She says that this leads female and male children, the lack of a strong mother leads female and male children being starved of matrimony or the physical and psychological nurturance of a powerful and humane female figure in their lives. And this is especially true when children realize who is actually in control and powerful outside of the home. So there's a question of how does this unmet need for a powerful female nurturance play out for women? Chesler argues it leads to the rejection of the mother and the worship of the father, as there's apparently no one else to worship. The female children see that the father is the more powerful one. She says that the origins of fear and hatred of women remains unknown, but that our culture has enhanced and normalized it. The result of living in a misogynistic culture is that when female children turn to their fathers for physical affection and emotional nurturance, because they can't, in a lot of ways, find that from their mother, this is experienced as sexual for the adult male, because the interaction is predicated on innocence, helplessness, youthfulness, and monogamous adultery. And a limitation of the book here is that Chesler doesn't explain why these features are experienced as sexual or desirable for adult males, and why they lead to this incestuous model of sexuality. And it's only that later theorists, such as Sheila Jeffrey, will argue that it is because subordination and powerlessness is sexualized, it is eroticized. And Dworkin argues that this is because, Andrew Dworkin, because through the act of sex, men can establish and maintain their dominance, especially as sex is, and I quote Catherine McKinnon, forced upon women and constitutive of the meaning of gender. So if, as McKinnon argues, male dominance is sexual, then women's sex and sexuality must be based and constructed around male intrusion, aggression, and boundary violation. For that to occur without conflict, without women questioning this system, women's sexuality has to be defined around powerlessness. So that is innocence, youth, physical smallness, shortness, limited movement, limited speech, limited mental capacity, and limited opportunities and economic capabilities, all of which, as we know, is defined as typical femininity. Chesler continues, our culture is, as a result, male homosexual. And this is actually one of the really interesting points about the book. She says, our whole culture is based on the male love of men. Both sexes find that the adult world is dominated by men, and this is said to be liberating for males and disempowering for females. So how do women navigate the culture then with no support from their mothers? Exactly by experiencing this incestuous model of sexuality. Women quickly learn what is valued and expected of them and what is not. And the molding of oneself to fit into this regime and system, according to Chesler, is maddening. A notable quote where Chesler says, as women, most of our lives with men are dramatic and theatrical affairs. We play at being women. We dress up like mummy for daddy's sake. We're always on stage working at being some other woman, a beautiful woman, a happy woman, a well-paid for woman. And overall, women are driven mad by this lack of individuality and the lack of access to power and culture. So going forward, she says, by the 20th century, mental asylums have been set up like bureaucratized families. So Chesler compares the patient woman as the child who is subordinated to other women, that is nurses and attendants, who are also quite powerless in terms of the hospital hierarchy and often who don't like their daughters / the patients. Mental patients are considered less human as they're abandoned by their families. There's no way or no one to tell them what is happening to them. And an interesting point is when Chesler says men in asylums are treated as women, that is helpless, dependent, sexless, unreasonable, describing them as crazy, annoying, inconvenient, stubborn, childish, tyrannical. Women end up being punished for their socially conditioned / socially approved self-destructive behaviors. So the same ones that we were taught were expected and desirable and needed to survive. And again, she reinforces it that the claim that all women have been poorly nurtured, so deprived of a strong female hero, and refused mothering by men as female adults. So women often settle for being mothered as psychiatric patients, hence why more women go into therapy than men. Chesler explains that this is almost like a shameful return to childhood for women and men, where sexual repression plays out differently for women than men. So men who are considered mad often act out in socially deviant ways. So her examples include homosexuality, rape, robbery, while women become very self-deprecating, depressed, suicidal. And this is a really fascinating point because while men act out to punish others for their state of madness, women punish themselves. So this may be associated with shame, self-hatred, self-blame, this inherent feeling of not being good enough as women, not being, never being able to achieve that female ideal. She then goes into the typically female symptoms of madness, including depression, frigidity, suicide, and schizophrenia. So overall, what Chesler's saying is that women are mad because it represents a socially powerless individual's attempts to unite body and feeling. Madness occurs when women act out the devalued female role, or they totally or partially reject the sex role stereotype. So either way you look at it, we lose because we're considered mad. So who are the clinicians that Chesler's talking about and who the women in her book are talking about? Well, at the start of chapter 3, Chesler defines clinicians as powerful because it is them who get to decide who is insane, why they're insane, what should be done about it, and if they should be released from treatment. So ultimately, the clinician has the most power in the therapist setting. Often, the clinicians are middle-aged men who prefer a young, attractive female patient who does not have more than a bachelor's degree. For Chesler, she says that this is about fetishizing control and being superior to the female, who often the clinician has projected his forbidden longing for dependency, emotionality, and subjectivity. Therapists believe that for a woman to be healthy, she must accept the behavioral norms of her sex. So abused women are blamed for their abuse. Women are often told to go back to their husbands and to restore feminine health by wearing makeup and having heterosexual sex. Just a side note here, it's interesting that this is the prescription that women are given, because the only sexual image we have of women in our culture is a prostitute. And who is a prostitute? Degraded, abused, always sexually available, and most importantly, always enjoying this abuse. And prostitution by the clinicians is viewed as female revenge rather than female victimization, and the result of poverty, abuse, exploitation, and the male demand for sex with children. So I think this is a really strong point from Chesler's analysis when she's really saying it's not the kind of political and economic and the cultural conditions, whereas the therapist will always individually blame women for their life circumstances. The clinicians also view childbirth and marriage as spiritual luxuries, and of course, enact and use a lot of Freud's analysis, where women are seen as resentful children with uteruses who are mourning the loss of male organs and male identity. And we're being conditioned to love this kind of subordinate status. So yeah, I might just, that's a really nice segue, because that's how Chesler sets up who these clinicians are. And then we move on to interviews with women. Yeah. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. So a big part of the book is where Chesler actually goes out and interviews women with experience of psychiatric treatment, about how they got there, how they responded to it, whether it helped or not. We can't possibly cover it all because, as I say, it is a very thick book, this, and it's been very difficult to get it down into an hour. So I'm not going to be able to sort of say as much about these women as I would like to. And we've actually been covering 2 or 3 of the topics that she covers. But one of them is women who had sex with their therapists. And it was shocking, you know, the way these women just saw the abuse as routine and normal. And they often, they saw it as that the therapist was and then were having an affair. And it often wasn't until it was over that the woman realised that she'd been used and exploited. And she says that's because the abuse of women and girls is so common as to be invisible, it's rarely prosecuted. It's due to the impact of the incestuous model of sexuality that we've just discussed. You know, so women are vulnerable to seeing the psychiatrist as a father figure, and then seeing them as their saviour. And an interesting point she makes is sex between a male boss and a female worker is quite common as a form of exploitation. But in this case, the woman is actually the employer. She's paying, but she still is the vulnerable and exploited one. And she says that the women that had sex with therapists were often trying to be conventionally feminine and are often insecure, and they confuse their need for sort of selfhood with the need for romantic love. And sadly, some of the women were blaming themselves for being seductive as a reason for this abuse from the therapists. And bizarrely, the sex was often suggested as part of the treatment, that it would be a cure for the women's sexual problems. But many of the women said that the therapists were actually clumsy and inadequate at sex, and they didn't orgasm. So, you know, they weren't as good as they thought they would. But it wasn't not even discussed the way they're saying. It's like the therapist just lay down on the couch and kissed them. Yeah, I mean, it's just really, really shocking. But they were taking advantage of vulnerable women who'd come for help, who were lonely and, you know, needing security. So Martha was one of them. She admits she was looking for security through romantic love and thought she was having an affair. But at the end, she says, I was vulnerable and dependent on him. How could he behave so selfishly? He reinforced my dependencies. Another woman, Joyce, says, I needed him very badly, like he was God. He was mistreating me and I didn't want to admit it. I loved him. And then after he finished it, she said, I felt deserted and alone. So Chesler says, I think this is a good point, is women are conditioned to suffer as long as it keeps them in a relationship with a man. And there's certainly no evidence from these accounts that the therapy has helped the women. And the sexual exploitation, unsurprisingly, led to further problems of abandonment, depression, and even suicide attempts. And some of these therapists were serial offenders at this. They were maintaining a harem of patients as substitute wives. You know, yeah, the absolute patriarchal figure, using them for typing and babysitting as well as sexual services. One of the women said, you know, when I went back, he said he didn't want to sleep with me anymore, but he did want me to type a book for him. It's just, anyway, Cindy's going to do a bit more.
So I looked at also chapter 7, which was on lesbians, because it was really interesting to see how lesbian women experienced therapy and how lesbianism was understood within this psychiatric setting. So Chesler says that, you know, our culture, she establishes that the culture that we exist in is anti-female, widely egotistical and pro-war. And here it's that where and as a result, lesbianism is incompatible. It was considered maladaptive, regressive, and infantile by professionals. She says lesbianism was being punished by being legislated out of the realm of possibility for most women. So she says this comes down to women, one, being denied nurturing sexual role models, again, that strong female mother figure, 2, being socially conditioned to be sexually timid. And again, the only cultural reference to sexuality that we have is a prostitute. Number 3, being psychologically conditioned to think that we need men to survive socially and economically. And 4, being denied female sisterhood. The only access to sisterhood we have is based on servicing the husband, the child, or the male god. Chesler argues it's theoretically easier for women to love women than it is for men to love men. And it's here on page 243 where she indirectly critiques transgenderism. This is one of the many kind of references to transgenderism throughout the book, but it's never kind of direct. It's always quite indirect. She says, all things female are despised, quote, yet I wonder, why would anyone willingly offer up their feet for binding? And if they do, isn't it to better attract, support, and worship men? Interestingly, I have been told that many male to female transsexuals identify as lesbians and look for lesbian partners. So what Chesler's saying is that although transsexualism was still an emerging phenomenon, psychologically, she already started associating it with male sexual fantasies and role play. And this is where she clearly says, you know, why would anyone bind their feet? I mean, what's the kind of outcome? What's the reward for doing that? What's the end goal? And then it is later she reveals that it is about kind of male colonization of the female body. She argues that whereas very few lesbians are sexually aggressive, non-monogamous, and anti-romantic, it's male homosexuality that is the basic and extreme expression of phallus worship and misogyny. So that might be quite a contentious point, but it's an interesting one indeed, because she says perhaps it's not the individual homosexual men who are misogynistic, but it's the kind of culture and it's the psychology of male to male love that excludes the female. Within this culture, she says, many lesbians believe only women can be midwife, mother, sister, daughter, and lover to the woman as a human being. And this is one of the, it's a really interesting quote, because it says that only women can truly see women as human, as completely human, whereas men will often, see us as this, dehumanize us for their own sexual pleasure. She then introduces theory from Dr. Charlotte Wolf, and I'm not actually familiar with Dr. Charlotte Wolf or any of her work, but through Chesler, we learned that Wolf proposes that the essence of lesbianism is emotional incest with the mother, and that love usually flourishes within the context of sameness and harmony. So in a way, what I find interesting is what she's saying, that emotional incest with the mother, but as we know, by Chesler's analysis, what was set up in chapters 1 to 3 is that mother equals loser, right? So mother is powerlessness. So it's almost that women will recognize the powerlessness in each other and find love within that sameness. But Chesler then says she doesn't have any basic theory to offer. So in a way, she's, by using Dr. Wolf's analysis, she's operating from a psychoanalytic tradition and sees lesbianism as a normal response to nurturance deprivation. There's almost a limitation here, because she, in both approaches, that, lesbianism is the emotional incest with the mother, or that lesbianism is the normal response to women's oppression. Both approaches assume that lesbianism is because of men and patriarchy. It's almost like she doesn't really say that women can love women in their own right. In terms of the interviews, there are a few really interesting quotes that I'll just read out, because I find them, it was really fascinating to read about them. So the first one is with Lewis, who says that one therapist kept insisting I wasn't gay, but he told me it's something I'll outgrow. He told me I'd end up alone and bitter in the gay scene, and that didn't appeal to me. It still doesn't. Another woman therapist said, but men are so marvelous to sleep with. Lesbianism isn't necessary, it's absurd. And then Carol says, the therapist felt that the feelings I had for women were basically anti-male feelings instead of pro-women feelings. And Frances, she says, I fell in love with a girl for the first time when I was 24. I'd been in therapy at a hospital clinic and told my therapist about it when he came back from his vacation. He freaked out. He started yelling at me. You're doing this because you think I'm your father and you want to hurt your father. You're a spoiled child. The minute I go away, you do this, you go out and do something that can be so dangerous. And we also see, I think this is also interesting from Frances. She says, that the therapist was telling her, let a man touch you. You're too sensitive to a male touch, because I had been. She says, I was getting very uptight, at being touched by men. A lot of men come up to you in a very familiar way, touch you like you're a piece of equipment, or I don't know, like you don't belong to yourself. They come and touch you as if you owe them this kind of thing, to be soft, to be responsive to them. And it really got me uptight. The therapist was about 45 and very charismatic, very demonic. He told me to masturbate and didn't believe that I did. He wanted me to show him right there in the office. He said if I didn't get laid by the third date, the guy was a fag. So I started fucking men. Dr. B said I was very frigid, that I had a mask-like face. So yeah, just some of the few interesting quotes from that chapter.
Yeah. You do hope things have changed now, but I don't know. You also had a section where she interviewed women who'd become feminists. Now, this would have been in the very early 70s, so they were women that had only, feminism was still very new. you know, so they're women that are just coming into their feminist consciousness rather than women that have been feminists for a long time. I don't think she gives the ages, but I get the impression many of them were younger women from the stories they're telling. I mean, she starts the section with some speculations on the origins and, you know, nature of feminism, which I haven't really got time to go into. But one thing that she said that I think sort of struck me, she says that feminism, when it's a collective, not an individual ideology, is seen as fascistic. And she doesn't really explain why, you know, because I was thinking, you know, why? But we know now that it is seen as fascist because we have masked men shouting that at us when we're meeting. But it's just something that leapt out from the current context, but she doesn't really explain it. So she said that the feminists that she interviewed mostly been raised in conventional families with rigid sex roles where marriage and motherhood was seen as women's main aim. And that they had troubled relationships with their mothers, and problems that were similar to other women she interviewed, like confidence, self-esteem, saying no, finding a positive sexuality. And so some of the interesting, so I haven't got time to read them all out, but women in the workplace still, you know, sort of realizing how they were being expected to service male colleagues, being an office wife, but being excluded from networking, but then also finding that achievement-oriented women could be rejected by women's groups as too male identified. Some of them were trying to establish relationships with men, but found it was very difficult to escape from the sort of dominance and submission model. One of them described, leaving one man, going and living with another one that was supposed to be non-sexist, but still ending up playing an earth mother role. And again, the sort of bizarre behaviour from therapists, both and women as well as men, being told they needed to dress more conventionally, that marriage was the answer to all their problems, and being very judgmental, being condemned for being assertive and intelligent, for acting outside the traditional female role. But a growing awareness amongst the women of the sexist treatment they were getting. So, I'm not supposed to exist, I'm treated as invisible. So it's not yet clear how feminism has really changed much for those women, but it was in the very early days. One woman does talk about having a better relationship with her mother, having realised that her father was actually deliberately dividing mother and children. And another woman saying that she realised that women could be tender with each other, not just with men. So it was improving her relationships with other women. So you now have to try and do the conclusion in a short time. I've noticed some things in the comments about women finding it difficult to relate to because they're not their own experience of families wasn't like that, and nor was mine, and I found it quite difficult to relate to at times as well. But I suppose she's not. It can sound like she's speaking about everybody, but I don't think she's. I think because she is specifically focusing on women that have been damaged by patriarchy and the patriarchal nuclear family, which is key, to such an extent that they're seeking some sort of help with their distress. But I think it's ironic because she can come across as being quite negative about women. She says right at the start, psychiatry blames mothers for problems, but there is a hint of that in her account of mothers in the family. Now, okay, you can say, well, the mothers themselves are victims of patriarchy and maybe doing things, because of domination by the husband and things like that. But yeah, I think that there's lots and lots of good things in this book, but some of it, I think, is as everything up for critique.
Yeah, and she doesn't. I mean, there's a lack of explanation on what a strong female nurturing mother, how that would affect the female consciousness. So it would be good maybe she gave that contrast. So for women who maybe aren't diagnosed as mad, how does the mother's role play into that? Why is it just mad women that that are nutrients, deprived of nutrients. Yeah.
So I don't know, have you got anything in particular to say about the conclusion, Cindy? I've got some.
I mean, I think she offers hope in sisterhood. She does outline there are limitations to feminist organization and activism, and she does go into kind of, she does say that it's really difficult to escape those psychological trappings of female conditioning that's based on male power and dominance. She does offer like a sort of the Amazon myth as a sort of alternative and a way forward for women. But, perhaps in our time in 2022, we can see that maybe we need more than that. Maybe that's, something that this is like a potential, point of discussion that we can have. What are the, alternative myths, not just the Amazon myth, that we can identify with and find strong female heroes and mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I think she can be quite, there's quite a section on women in groups and how women can be quite destructive to each other, the ideas of trashing that I think we're familiar with. And she keeps saying that women don't like other women, which again, I don't think is true. She seems to imply that women in groups are always going to be competitive and destructive, but there's lots of examples of women that have been, offered each other support and solidarity, not necessarily in conscious feminist ways, but just in everyday life to get through. And I was wondering at one point, well, she keeps saying women don't like other women, and I'm thinking, does she like other women? I was kind of picking up that there is, there is that kind of slight. I mean, she ends, I think she does try and end on a hopeful note on sort of how we take ourselves forward, and how we can actually change. I mean, she thinks women need to have power, and she's ambivalent at times about whether that is actually needs to be sort of violence or at least self-defense, whether we need to counter men in the sex war with our own resistance. But certainly we need to get power in male institutions, and we also need to change our own psychology. And I think that's the most difficult thing, because she says really things won't change unless we can change female psychology. And so that women need to shift from self-sacrifice and guilt and putting others first, to put ourselves first, to have our own power and not concentrate on pleasing men, which is fair enough, but it's difficult. It's difficult and frightening. It goes against the grain of our feminine feelings, but we need to stop apologizing, withdraw from the patriarchal hatred of women's bodies and our addiction to a relationship at any price. So I don't know if there's any final words, Cindy. That's my final bit. I don't know whether Cindy wants to.
I think that was a great question.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good book. I'm glad I reread it. I don't always agree with it, and I know there was women in the comments saying they didn't agree with it, but I think it makes you think whether or not you agree with it, and that's why I think it's still worth reading. And there are bits that we didn't really cover, like some of the experiences of women in asylums and that sort of thing, that certainly need to be read.
Heard and heard. Yeah.
Read and heard. So thank you, everybody, and see you in a future week, all of you.